This year we decided we'd head south and track down till we hit the New South Wales southern coast. From there we'd track around and follow the Victorian coastline till we got to Portland, and then we'd come back overland. Once we got to about Moree, there were a number of cold fronts coming through from the west, and we decided that it wasn't reasonable to keep on going south, so we diverted toward the west and looked at a few different places in northern western New South Wales and Queensland. Day one saw Brett and I leaving Atherton on a clear, cold morning with lots of low fog, and we headed toward Innisfail, where we met up with Martin and Rob. From Innisfail we then tracked toward Charters Towers for a quick top-up of fuel, and then from Charters Towers we headed towards Emerald. From Emerald, we made the short hop to Springshaw. Just south of Emerald, we crossed over the Fairbairn Dam. Although it's got nice cross runways with a good bitumen strip, the Springshaw airport's pretty primitive. Springshaw itself is quite a pretty little town. It's very clean and quite hilly. We made the relatively short trip initially to Roma for a bit more fuel, and then down to Moree across the Queensland-New South Wales border. Just south of Springshaw you cross the Carnarvon Ranges with their spectacular cliffs and sandstone escarpments. When I landed at Moree, I had some problems with the brake master cylinder. Fortunately, Jabiru use a lot of off-the-shelf automotive parts, and we were able to get a replacement pretty easily from Repco. The next day we woke to heavy fog almost to the ground that didn't lift until about 10 o'clock. It also delayed a couple of commercial flights coming in, one of which carried my girlfriend Heidi, who was coming to join us for the rest of the trip. Overnight, because of the weather to the south, we decided we had to rejig the trip. So instead of continuing south, we turned a bit southwest. We had a look at the map and there was a place called Nyngan, not too far away. We knew nothing about it, we'd never been there, so it was a good excuse to go. Apart from being home to about 1 million galahs, Nyngan is a pretty little town with not much else going for it. Its sole claim to fame seems to be that in 1990 the whole town was evacuated in helicopters due to flooding, and the town rests on its laurels of being the only town that was completely evacuated in such a manner. And then on to our final destination of the day of White Cliffs. White Cliffs is New South Wales's version of Coopapedy. It's an opal mining town and most of the houses are built underground. There are distinct areas in the town. Part of it is a mining area, part of it is a residential area, and part of it is the normal business type area. From the air you can look down into the openings of the opal mines that look like barnacles. So even though the houses and motels are underground, they mostly go into the sides of hills rather than dig down vertically. The hotel was built in 1984 and the room's still pretty basic in about the 1984 fashion. You have to have shared toilets, and if you walk out the back door, you go up the stairs and end up on the roof. Looking at it, I guess it was probably about half the buildings were underground and half the buildings were your standard above ground style. The next morning when we arrived at the airport, the place was pretty busy. There was a flying doctor aircraft in, and we didn't see any patients, but there was quite a large crew there, so we assumed they were dropping people off for a clinic. From White Cliffs, we headed back down to Wilcannia, where we met up with the Darling River, and then we followed the Darling River southbound toward the lakes at Menindee. From Menindee, we turned west and headed toward what would become our most southerly stop at Broken Hill. Broken Hill's got a pretty big airport. It's home to the region's Flying Doctor Base and services much of the southeast corner of Australia. The base has a museum that's well worth seeing, and we took the guided tour, and it turned out to be pretty informative and well worth the time. Broken Hill's an old city as far as Australian cities are concerned, and there's quite a lot of history in the streets and the buildings. No trip to Broken Hill is complete without a trip to Silverton. Silverton's one of those places that's more famous for being famous than because of much that's happening there now. Many of the scenes around Silverton will be strangely familiar to most people. Silverton is generally known as the location of filming for the second in the Mad Max movie series, but it turns out it was also the location for 26 movies and TV series, mostly in the 1980s, and it's also the location for lots of Australian TV commercials. There's not much happening there now though, except for the tourists and some quirky art galleries. The following day we went back to Silverton to an old 1880s silver mine that now runs as a tourist display mine. After Silverton, we headed back to the centre of town and went back to the heart of Broken Hill's history, to the mines and the miners who lived here. On the remains of the Broken Hill, after which the town is named, there's a memorial to the hundreds of miners who lost their lives here. The following day, we woke to low cloud and rain and quickly realised that we wouldn't be leaving that day, so we made it a day of art galleries and museums. Broken Hill's favourite artistic son, Pro Hart, has a gallery here, and it was well worth the visit. The rain that stopped us leaving was part of a series of cold fronts coming through to the south, so we decided that we'd had enough of the bad weather and we turned north. Despite this, we woke to a beautiful blue sky day, but to a bunch of guys from the tropics, we weren't prepared for the ice on the wings. Nothing to do but wait until the sun melted the ice. From Broken Hill, we headed north to Cameron's Corner. Cameron's Corner is the spot where the Queensland, New South Wales and South Australian borders all meet. There's an airstrip, a roadhouse and a concrete pillar there. The roadhouse serves food and drinks and has some basic accommodation. There's no avgas, but you can get premium unleaded. After a brief lunch, we headed to the Birkenwills Dig Tree at Napa Merry. The Burke and Wills dig tree is the site of one of Australia's most well-known tragedies. In fact, it was a litany of tragedies that reads a bit like a black comedy. In 1861, Burke and Wills and a group of explorers headed out from Melbourne to try and cross Australia from south to north. They got as far as this spot and then decided a small group of them would go north and leave the rest behind. After an agreed period of time, when the small group hadn't returned, the main party buried a cache of food at the base of a tree and then carved the word dig into the tree. After that, they left. Coincidentally, on the same day, a starving Burke, Wills and King staggered back into the camp. They eventually perished after relying on native food, which turned out to be toxic. The only survivor of the group was King, who was taken in by the local Aboriginals. From the dig tree, we headed over to Inaminka to pick up some fuel, and this is where I came unstuck and got severely embarrassed by landing at the wrong airstrip. In my defence, the maps only showed 2 airstrips, so I landed at the one that I could see that ran in the right direction. Sadly, there were actually 3. The following day, realising that I was never going to live down that bit of embarrassment, we headed off from Inaminka and headed towards Longreach. Longreach is one of those places where I'd never actually been into town. I've been to the airport multiple times, and at the airport there's the Qantas Founders Museum. Across the road there's the Stockman's Hall of Fame, and then there's a string of motels just across the road from there. So there's not been a lot of call to go into town. This time we thought we'd go in and have a good look around. The following day saw us separate as a group. Heidi and I had to head back to Cairns to work the following day, and then the other guys wanted to catch up with friends down at Isisford and another friend at Blackall. So we separated at that point. Heidi and I headed up to Hughenden for fuel and then back to Atherton.